about politics. First of all, what is politics? If you look up a definition of politics, you'll probably see something concerning governance. Governance, those responsible and accountable to the franchise. Who is the franchise? The franchise is you. You are part of a corporation called the United States, and your rights are embedded in the franchise. So much so that at one point you were not part of the franchise. So you had no rights. You had no property rights. You had no part in the government, the power which was part of the government that allowed you to see and to live your life according to your responsibility and intent. Okay, let me give you a better definition of politics, because we need to make sure that we are engaging in the franchise when we look at it from this extent. Politics is about power.
That's right.
I'm going to say that again. Politics is about power. So much so that in this country, people are willing to disenfranchise you and have disenfranchised you in order to maintain that power relationship. So much so that during our course of history, some people have even been murdered or assassinated in order to maintain that power differential.
That's right.
So, being a physics professor, of course, I have to relate this word power to some other concepts that we study in the natural sciences, being energy. Okay, energy is directly related to power. So much so, you get up in the morning, what do? You eat, because contained in that food is energy. And you eat that food to carry out your work functions for the day. So without energy, you can't carry out your work functions for the day. And then, of course, life ceases to exist without energy. So when we think power, I want you to think about energy and work. Okay?
Right.
Energy and work. What I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to talk about the two-party system, why we have it, and why many of us in the community have historically, especially in the black community, have stated the need for a third party.
Right.
And when I hear that, I'm immediately thinking to myself, okay, we don't really understand how our political system works.
Right.
So I'm going to tell you about why we have a two-party system and why a three-party system is a non-starter. Okay, from the very beginning, let me make this clear. We've always had more than two parties. We've always had more than two parties, but historically, only two parties have ever prevailed.
Right.
Okay, we're going to see some names. We've changed the names of the parties. The two parties that we are familiar with today are, of course, the Democratic Party
right.
and the Republican Party. But we've had previous parties to that. Okay, I won't talk about those previous parties. I want to focus on the two because those two are germane to us. They are important to us.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party. Of course, we know that we have the South and the North, generally. The South favored slavery. The Democratic Party was set up for that purpose. In about 1928, circa 1928 or so, the Democratic Party was founded. And one of the seminal founders during that time was a man by the name of Andrew Jackson, who would later become president. Of course, he was pro-slavery. Sometime later would come the Republican Party, which was set up to abolish slavery. So it's important for us to understand that, because as I progress through my talk, I want to talk about how the ideologies of those two parties have changed over time according to people's needs.
Right.
We're talking about the needs of the franchise, those who had the ability to vote, and thus those who had the power to control the affairs of their lives. Very important for us to understand. And if you haven't heard that name, Andrew Jackson, let me bring it to your recollection. If you follow politics, our 45th president uses the name or has remarked on Andrew Jackson as one of our great presidents. Now think about that. Andrew Jackson was pro-slavery.
Right.
He was also an Indian killer.
Come on.
He was a military general. He was an Indian killer. If you remember the Trail of Tears, then he was part of that decimating
Right.
the Native Americans. So that is the founding of the Democratic Party. Very important for us to understand that. I'm also going to talk about Obama,
Come
the
on.
Obama legacy.
Right.
We're going to talk about the rise of Donald Trump.
Come on.
But if you don't get anything out of what I am saying today, and that is your need or your requirement actually to be involved in the franchise. The franchise is your power. So we're going to talk about that. Then I'm going to conclude with the ATOS movement, what we're doing in here in Dayton concerning the ATOS movement.
All right.
And the need for and the foundation of Friends of ATOS PAC, which is the super PAC. We're going to conclude with that. But let's talk about this two-party system. It is basically legislated into law. It is legislated into law. What do I mean by that? Most of the states, your voting rights actually happen at the state level. Okay, it is the state where, of course, you have citizenship, and the state governs elections. Very important for us to understand that. So the states, since about 1824 or so, have adopted what is called a winner-take-all system. Let me say that again, a winner-take-all system. And what that basically means is that, for example, if we have two candidates, one Republican, one Democratic, running for office in each state, the one who wins the majority of the votes wins all of the Electoral College votes. Okay, say for example, and don't quote me on the numbers because they change with each bicentennial when they count the population. For example, Ohio, I think, has about 18 Electoral College votes, 16 congressional districts for the House, and then 2 for the Senate. Okay, so, and that number has come down, I think, from maybe 22 or so. So Ohio is losing population. I also want to make a prediction. I want to predict that Ohio now, instead of being a swing state, is now a red state. You should be familiar with the red states.
And the blue.
Those are states that historically vote for the Republican Party, right?
That's right.
And then the blue states historically vote for the Democrats. And there are some states, regardless of the period, or really not the period, that at this point in the modern times will always vote for the Democrat or the Republican. Give an example. California, 55 Electoral College votes. Historically votes Democrat. A little bit more history. The South, from the Civil War all the way up to the Civil Rights era, was historically Democrat. Now they are Republican. And we're going to talk about how that happened when we talk about the Southern strategy. But I want to stay on this winner-take-all system for a minute, because I want to tell you that although we've had the civil rights period,
Come on, brother.
black people in the South
Right.
are still disenfranchised when it comes to presidential elections. I'm going to tell you how. All but 2 states have a winner-take-all system. Nebraska and Maine have what's called a proportional system. So they're set up in a way so that each political party candidate could win. Okay, and even a third party has a chance of winning in Nebraska or Maine. I give an example, Maine. 2 congressional districts, 1 electoral college vote, and then 2 at-large votes. So in each one of those districts, the person who has the most votes wins that district, that 1 electoral college vote. So there's an opportunity for, say, a Democrat to win in one of those congressional districts, a Republican to win in the 2nd congressional district, and then a third party, 2 electoral college votes to win at large. That means that we look at the whole state. How does the whole state vote as opposed to how does that particular district vote for that candidate? But in all the other 40 states, and I want to focus on the South, well, about 11 or so states or so that have, since the 60s, historically voted, or at least until the 60s, have historically voted Democrat. Pro-slavery, right?
Right.
States' rights. And we're going to talk about how that happened. Generally in an election, because of the way that each part of the country votes, what we find out that there's generally about 9 or 11 states that are really going to determine who becomes the president. And we refer to those as swing states because one election cycle they may vote Democrat, the other election cycle they may vote Republican. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to transition into the Southern Compromise and why that was important and why that changed the landscape and the ideology for our modern political system. It's very important for us to understand that.
Right.
But let me say this part first about why blacks in the South are disenfranchised. It's a winner-take-all system there. And they aren't the majority. Right? So the majority gets all of the electoral college votes. Let me say that again. Let's use Mississippi, for example, where about 38% of the population of there is black. And then, of course, the majority is white. Well, who did they vote for in the last election? Of course, they voted for Donald John Trump. John, that's a Christian name. I always wanted to say that. John is a Christian name, but this man ain't no Christian. Okay? So in other words, let's say all that 38% voted for Hillary Rodham Clinton. And let's say we had a number of whites. It had to be a small number. It wasn't 51%. So John Trump got all of those votes. So what does that mean about the 38% of the black folks that voted? Their vote didn't count.
That's right.
That's the winner-take-all system.
Right.
Now, ideally what happens is that those of us who know the numbers understand that we're going to vote for the candidate that we think has the best chance of winning. We're not going to vote. I'm saying the majority of us are not going to vote for a candidate whom we think has no chance of winning. Thus, we end up with only 2 candidates that we vote for. Now, there is a qualification. And I need you to listen to this. There's only been 2 occasions when a third-party candidate has received any electoral college votes. They generally may get a percentage of the popular vote, but they never get an electoral college vote. Been 2 times. 1948, this gentleman by the name of Strom Thurmond was running on a segregationist platform. He won electoral college votes. And don't quote me on the number, but I want to say it was probably around 40-something votes. And then in 20 years later, 1968, there was another gentleman who ran on a segregationist platform. His name was 68. George Wallace. He ran on a segregationist platform. Iris, I knew you would know that. And of course, he was defeated, but he also won electoral college votes. And he was quoted as saying, after he lost, that he will never be out-niggered again. He said that he was out-niggered, and that's why he lost. But I want to bring to your attention that only in those two cases concerning racism, i.e. segregationist, i.e. states' rights, these are the terms that you're going to hear that will signal that we're looking at a racist. A person who intends to win on a segregationist platform. I'm going to speak about that more when I make my way toward Donald John Christian name Trump. Okay, so this Southern strategy started, perhaps, I'm sure it's been used throughout history, but it was amplified during 1960s with a gentleman by the name of Barry Goldwater, who was running on limited government. These are terms I want you to be familiar with that signal segregationism, racism, and white supremacy. Limited government. Well, of course, if we limit the actions of the government and the revenue of the government, of course, those social programs that both Republicans and Democrats brought about starting in the 1920s with, at least on a platform, the Bull Moose platform. Who's familiar with Bull Moose? The Bull Moose platform. A gentleman by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a Republican. He was running on what some would refer to as today as a socialist platform. And then, of course, he lost because he split the vote with another Republican by the name of William Taft. They split the vote. Democrat wins. His name was Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson took some of the platform initiatives of Theodore Roosevelt and put them in place himself, i.e. women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment, i.e. workers' compensation, i.e. limiting the 8-hour workday for railroad workers, and other social programs that today are frowned upon. I mentioned earlier, we talked about how the ideologies changed. Okay, so ideologies are not fluid. And very important for us to understand that, because I know there's some black Republicans out there. I'm going to spare you today, but I think some of you black Republicans feel that we're still during the days of the abolitionist Republicans, the Frederick Douglass Republicans, when I've shown you at least on a few occasions where that ideology has changed. Now that brings us back to the Southern strategy and Barry Goldwater. Of course, he ended up losing. But he set the stage for another gentleman to follow, and his name was Richard Nixon, who had run for president twice, or maybe even 3 times, 60, 64, and then eventually winning in 68. Okay? He used the Southern strategy to full effect. Now, what does that mean? That means they were setting up Republican strongholds in the South. Keep in mind, the South was strongly Democratic, pro-segregationist. Important for us to understand that. And then, of course, during that same period, we had Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Democrat from Texas. Keep this in mind now. This is a Democrat who was part of a party that was pro-slavery, instituting something called the Civil Rights Era, which actually started in the 50s, right? Brown versus Board of Education set the foundation for all of that, and without Brown versus Board of Education, we probably don't have the civil rights law. So it's important for us to understand, at least from this one point, I'm not going to go too far into this, the importance of the Supreme Court. Because the Supreme Court is the final authority on the law, right? They're the final authority on the law and provide a check and a balance on both the House, the Senate, and of course the executive branch. So without Brown versus Board of Education, it is highly unlikely we would have had the civil rights movements of the 60s. But Democrats and Republicans pushed that through, right? And then here comes Richard Nixon. Keep in mind that he was able to win by mobilizing Southerns who were against what? Who were against civil rights. So the strategy worked like this. Okay, from a Republican standpoint and Nixon's strategist, we don't want to mess with civil rights. We don't want to mess with civil rights because the enactment of civil rights is going to play to the hand of whom? White segregationists who are against civil rights. So no, we don't want to mess with civil rights. That's going to anger them more. And what you had was mass defection away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. I'll give you one example. I've already mentioned his name. Strom Thurmond, who was governor of South Carolina, defected away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, as an example. Okay, so here's this guy Nixon, who wins the presidency. But here's what a lot of people don't know. The Democrats still control the House and the Senate. And I'm only bringing this about because many times we will judge a president and say either he is effective or ineffective, and we never look at the circumstances surrounding his ability to govern, and that is who controls the House, who controls the Senate. So yes, Nixon won in 1968, but the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. So there was only so much that he can do. But here's why Richard Nixon is important. He was able to, he was very important in the use of the Southern strategy. Trump perfected it. Okay, but I want you to understand that Richard Nixon, I refer to him, I'll just use an analogy. Let's say Nixon was Satan. Why Republicans are able to govern the way that they are today is because of the spawn that he created, the spawn of Satan.
Come on, brother.
What do I mean by that? Most of the people that you have seen prior, after Richard Nixon were associated with his administration. Dick Cheney,
Yes.
Paul Wolfowitz,
Yes, sir.
and the list goes on and on.
Oh,
Robert Ailes. I want to talk about Robert Ailes for just a minute, but I want to talk about all of these folks that had direct connections or tangential connections with Richard Tricky Dick Nixon. Okay? He didn't have the control that he wanted. Sort of like in the same situation that Trump is in. So what do? You start to obstruct justice and all kinds of other things because you don't have the control that you would have if your party controlled the House and the Senate. Okay? So this Southern strategy moving forward was in part had to do with Robert Ailes was part of that. Now, if you don't know who Robert Ailes is, he's deceased now, recently deceased, but he is one of the founders of Fox News, right?
Right.
He also wrote a book that basically dictated to the Republican Party how they would rule government for years to come. Okay, he was a consultant, a marketing consultant to Richard Nixon. Okay, so we had, in the 80s, of course, we had Ronald Reagan, who also made use of the strategy. And every Republican president thereafter used elements of the Southern strategy to make sure that they would win that plurality, right? Or that majority vote, at least in the legislative branch. How has that turned out today? Up until that time, Democrats, for the most part, had control of government. And from Richard Nixon past up till the present, Republicans have mostly controlled the government. Let me show you how powerful this is. Let's think about Bill Clinton in the 90s. I think it was 92 or so he was elected president of the United States. His first 2 years in office, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. He was able to get significant legislation passed. But what happened in the midterms? The Republicans took over, controlled both the House and the Senate. So when you think about Bill Clinton and his legacy, what you are really looking at is a compromise. He didn't control legislation. The House controls legislation, right? And the Senate, the House controls the budget. The president does not control budgets. Okay? The Senate controls what? Who's appointed to the Supreme Court? These are separation of powers. So you can only do so much as a president if your party does not control the House and the Senate. I want to bring that forward. I've already mentioned it with Clinton, but the same is true with Obama. Because we got Obama haters out there. And I understand that, but what we have to understand that the same conditions that Clinton was under, Obama was under. First 2 years, when Obama won, 2008, right? Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. Significant legislation was passed. Obamacare, fair pay for women, and some other things. But what happened in the midterms? The same thing happened under Clinton, right? The Republicans took control of both the House and the Senate. So only 2 of Obama's 8 years did Democrats have control, but yet we want to criticize Obama. He does not draft legislation. He has no control over the budget. That's the House, right? See where we're going? Very important for us to understand now. Now, that's not to say that Obama could not have done more. I'm going to leave that open because I don't have much time. My major point is this, at least concerning what I've said so far. If we're going to criticize a president, we must also include in that analysis who controls the House, who controls the Senate. It's very important. Now, what we have going on today, and let me tell you, I'm not a Republican. I'm going to tell you that right now. And I'm going to tell you why. This is very important. Number one, because the Republican Party of yesteryears is not the Republican Party of today. I like to say, and I say it a lot, that the Republican Party of today is the reformed Democratic Party because of the Southern white Democrats who defected from that party and are now part of the Republican Party. Real important. There's some other ideological things that have to do with liberalism and conservatism. I can't go into, I can say you this though, that the Democratic Party of today believes in social justice as compared to the Republicans of latter years who believed in social justice. I mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, social justice. He was a Republican. Okay, the Republicans of yesteryear are not the Republicans of today. That's the major point I want you to understand in that. Obama, real quick, he was not ATOS. Let me explain the ATOS of African American descent. This is a movement that is happening today. I want to at least try to get a little bit of time in on that. He was biracial, white mother who was from what history records, whose ancestors were slave owners. And he had a father that was from Kenya. As far as I understand, that was pretty prominent from a family standpoint, from a lineage standpoint. Obama, at least in my opinion, based on the evidence, was put into office because of the president before him. I'm talking about George Bush and his master, Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was part of, guess who? Administration. Richard Nixon. Very important to understand that. So here they go all over the world, destroying their historical enemy. Who is the historical enemy of the European? Well, you know you one of them, but there's another one. We call them Muslims. And see what your history, and even their history, doesn't record and make it known, is that the Ottoman Turks, Muslims, right?
Right.
Controlled Europe for about 1,000 years.
Right.
Controlled Europe for about 1,000 years. And we had something called the Christian Crusades. The Knights Templar, right? I want you to associate, these were Christian knights who protected Europeans on the way to Jerusalem, right? They were trained soldiers. Now, I want you to equate that with these terms here. Southern White Knights, Grand Master Ku Klux Klan, right?
Yes.
These are Knights Templar. That's what they based that on. And what you see going on today with these lone wolf killers, they're instigated by that same ideology.
That's right.
There's a man by the name of Anders Breivik. He's a Norwegian. He's a Northern European, German-speaking peoples, right? In about 2014, he wrote, I want you to pay attention to this, the European Declaration of Independence. And basically that's a 1,500-page manifesto that has to do with, among many other things, taking back Europe and making it an all-white homeland. Young man, militarily trained, put this manual together. He compiled some stuff, revisionist type stuff, and of course in there was the history of the Knights Templars. And of course, the majority of it had to do with the Muslims. And the Muslims taking over Europe for the most part. The Muslims being prominent in the United Nations and things of those sorts. So what you see today, since the 80s, has been a battle against Muslims. Over 14 invasions, bombings, and occupations since the 80s, and we're still counting. What we're looking at is revenge. Important for you to understand that the Ottoman Turks basically ruled the Sinai Peninsula and other parts of Europe until World War I. And they lost. And to the victor goes the spoils, right?
That's right.
They controlled the Sinai, which was Palestine then, and which is what now? Israel. Israel is a front.
That's right.
Israel is Europe's and America's front against the Muslims in the Middle East. It's important for us to understand that, because if we look back at the history, these European Jews that are over in Israel today were persecuted.
Right.
By whom? Christians. For 2,000 years, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church. See, we're not taught this in school. These are things that you have to go out and learn for yourselves. So what we're seeing today in the United States, this immigration, this Muslim ban, what we're seeing in Europe, What we're seeing is revenge. Important for us to understand that. And Trump, let me bring it home to Trump, and then I'll close. Hopefully I'll have enough time to close with the ATOS movement, what's going on there, and then what we're doing starting here in Dayton in terms of forming a super PAC in order for us to get in the game as well. Okay, Trump. I have read this document that I have talked to you about, this manifesto. And in there's 3 books. The last book is about warfare. Every imaginable level that you can think of is in there. Weapons of mass destruction, how to engage in terrorism, how to stockpile weapons, how to build dirty bombs, all of that. This man, Anders Breivik, went on to murder 77 people in Norway. He murdered his own people because he felt that they were allowing this Muslim incursion into Europe. And this BRITEX that you see, all of this is tied together. Britain was part of the European Union. All of these unions came about after what? 2 world wars. So nationalism, I want you to know this. Nationalism has brought nothing but world war. 2 of them. So out of that, you had the European Union. It's a union, it's an agreement, right? Cooperation among nations. You had the League of Nations, and then you had the United Nations. Well, what I want you to know, there's a resurgence in nationalism. Trump is part of it. Trump is the face of it. I want you to understand that. Every goal that is listed in this manifesto, Trump is promoting it. The Muslim ban, well, that's in the book. Immigration, we don't want immigration. We don't want to be part of United Nations. When you go to the United Nations, what do you see? You see non-Europeans. Very important for us to understand that. We don't want some other nation over in Europe telling us how to govern our affairs. Very important for us to understand that. But what they're going to find out is that many of these policies that they are promoting are going to end up sabotaging them. Okay? I'm not going to say too much more about that because I know I'm running on time. I want to talk about the ATOS movement. That stands for African American Descendants of Slavery. I'm sure it goes by other names, but the main program has to do with reparations. So you're going to see a lot of activity being galvanized around that. And I just make this observation that that movement coincides with other nationalist movements. It looks nationalistic, but it's not. Okay? And let me tell you why that is important. Barack Obama said that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Sounds good, but it doesn't decrease wealth gaps. It doesn't decrease income gaps. It doesn't decrease educational gaps. Okay, because those 2 ride in tandem. He brags about the unemployment rate among blacks without mentioning that the unemployment rate for whites is also very low. So those 2 track together. What we have not seen is the closure between the unemployment gap between whites and blacks, and especially the wealth gap. But we don't really have time to go into that. Let me finish. Okay, let me finish with just this one. Friends of ATOS PAC. This is something that Angela Jones and I founded. It's a nonprofit, federally registered, independent expenditure committee, also called a super PAC. Our mission is to engage our constituents at the highest levels in power politics at the federal, state, and local levels. More specifically, we support or attack political candidates, elected officials, and ballot issues which support or deny political, economic, and social justice to our constituents who are American descendants of slavery, and we defend against their incessant political persecution anywhere within our national borders. What's our agenda? To reduce wealth, income, and educational gaps between ATOS and the majority population. To do so, we bring front and center to elected officials and candidates the bona fide justice claim of reparations for force-free labor, subjugation to black codes, Jim Crow, passive nullification during the civil rights era, and political persecution during the current era. what you refer to as police brutality is actually political persecution. Our mantra is the rising tide may lift all boats, but it does not reduce wealth, income, and educational gaps. To eliminate political persecution of ATOS. To do so, we hold elected officials and candidates accountable for acts of passive nullification, i.e. claiming full compliance with equal opportunity laws while subverting programs to deny political, economic, and educational benefits to ATOS, and we hold them accountable for state-sanctioned political persecution of ATOS by police, including unwarranted extrajudicial killings. That's what we have. To support and defend democracy for ATOS. To do so, we organize at the grassroots level by knocking on doors, making phone calls, and getting our constituents out to vote for candidates and elected officials who support their full access to the ballot and who will defend against voter suppression and unethical redistricting. Okay? We're going to meet August 29th.
August 29th at 6 o'clock at the library, second floor.
6 o'clock, downtown library, August 29th. That's the Thursday. We want you there. We're going to form a ATOS chapter here in Dayton. Thanks for listening.
Let's give our brother Marlon, another round of applause. Brother was hot. And you know what, brothers and sisters, I want to thank you all for coming out here and being a part of this lecture series. For me, of course, I believe that this lecture series is one of the most important parts of the African American Cultural Festival because knowledge is power.